Hi, I'm Vicki Bester. I was Executive Director of NCC from 1999 to 2017. And I'm here today to talk to Amy Heinrich, who was the founding director of the NCC, and Eric Gangloff, who was for many years the executive director of the Japan-US Friendship Commission, one of the two major funders that helped found the NCC and its most steadfast funder to this day. So, Amy, you, I know, did your PhD at Columbia and worked closely with Donald Keene. Eric, I believe you got your PhD from the University of Chicago.
Yeah.
And both of you are literature folks, correct?
Yes.
Eric, you were at the commission from 1985 to 2011. Is that
Right.
correct?
That's right.
That's a long time.
Yeah, it was. It was a very long career, and it was extremely satisfying. I think no one could have had a better job. I loved it.
Well, that's wonderful. For those who don't know about the Friendship Commission, can you give a little background on it?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. The commission is an independent federal agency. It's very small, a staff of 4 persons plus a board that is appointed through the executive branch, the Department of State. And this board oversees the spending of the interest on a trust fund that Congress established in 1976 from some funds that were being paid at the time by the Japanese government in repayment of certain debts from the occupation. It went way back. The funds were set aside, they're sequestered inside the US Treasury, and the interest can be spent only by the commission. So there's a dedicated funding source for the commission. It was set up in order to encourage exchange between Japan and the US at the highest levels of academic, artistic, intellectual exchange. And from the outset, it was seen as a major support for the field of Japanese studies across the United States. It first began funding in 1978, so it began to develop a series of programs from that point forward. And I think the interesting thing for the NCC is that that was only it was about 5 or 6 years after the Japan Foundation had made its original grants ever to 10 universities across the US.
Oh, right, Tanaka 10.
The so-called Tanaka 10. When I joined the commission in 1975, the commission had established a program of funding for one thing, the Inter-University Center to support language education. And its other major support was for libraries. And it had developed a program to support those 10 libraries, the so-called Tanaka 10. I was not I never knew how that was the basis for deciding which library got funding or not. At any rate, that was 1985, and there was a clear pattern of 4 million yen a year to each of the 10 libraries, which then consolidated on the East Coast, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Columbia University to use those monies in a shared collection, in a division of responsibilities. Certain libraries would work more in the social sciences, certain libraries would work in other fields, history, regional history, etc. The same was true for Chicago and Michigan in the Midwest. The same was true for Stanford and Berkeley on the West Coast. And then 2 more grants independently were made to University of Washington and University of Hawaii. Those were the 10 original grantees when I joined the commission in 1985. And the program seemed very stable, but even at that point, there were some problems that began to develop in the late 1980s that brought to ahead the Commission's difficulties in continuing that pattern of funding. For one thing, the Commission's funds the interest income was beginning to dwindle, diminish. The original bonds the Commission bought were in the late 1970s during the so-called inflation period of the Carter inflation, when we were getting bonds at 15%. We were getting 15% interest a year on every bond we bought. And by the time I joined the Commission, those had already aged out, and we had to buy new bonds at lower interest. So we were beginning to have less to spend. The second problem was the exchange rate was changing. Remember, the old rate had been a stable 360 yen to the dollar. That was set. There was no free exchange rate available, but that was broken. I forget when it was, but the exchange rate was rapidly descending. I think it was about 240 at that point from 360. The third problem was that the number of publications in Japan was beginning to grow exponentially, and particularly very large sets of academic publications that might be 20 or 30 volumes in a set. And fourth, their prices were beginning to jump astronomically. So we had this problem. We were facing a real issue across the United States in trying to keep library development stable, keep current in the libraries, with rapidly decreasing resources to do it. That was the background on calling a meeting at the Hoover Institution to try to understand how we could meet this problem as a general enterprise across Japanese studies in the US.
Wow. And at the same time, the number of institutions that were doing Japanese studies were mushrooming similarly.
That was the fifth issue that at the very end suddenly became a real issue. The Commission didn't, when I joined the Commission, there was no set criteria by which libraries would be selected. They were the old Tanaka 10. It was almost written in stone. And even then, I always wondered why, for example, UCLA was never included. It certainly had a library equivalent of most of the other libraries that were granted of the Commission. But at the same time, there were new programs coming along, and there were collections, for example, at Ohio State University that were beginning to develop very critical masses to reach what we finally agreed upon as the critical number of volumes that would be minimal for being considered for funding, 100,000 volumes. And OSU was the first new library, plus UCLA, to reach that goal. And the Commission began to fund them at it, and we couldn't say no because they met the criteria. At the same time, we had less money, the money was worth less in exchange rate, costs were going up, etc. So there was a real crisis.
Right. And one of the solutions to the crisis proposed, and what the NCC eventually tried to do, was to get the libraries to start thinking in terms of a national collection, so that we would work towards ways of sharing resources more efficiently and effectively.
Right. And so in the end of 1991, after the Hoover meeting that Eric just mentioned, it was announced by the Japan Foundation that this strategy, the creation of NCC, would begin in the following year, 1992. And at that time, it was announced by Eiichi Hamanishi, who was then the the Director General of Japan Foundation in the US, that you, Amy Heinrich, had been named as the first executive director of NCC, or the first chair of the NCC. So you were tasked with having the first meeting at Columbia in March of 1992 to get NCC off the ground. You want to tell us a little about that meeting?
Well, I'll tell you first that I was charged with several other things before that meeting. I was charged with writing a mission statement. I was charged with developing a membership for the meeting, and I was charged with naming it. And I think I got the mission statement right, and I got the membership right to begin with. And the name was always a pain in the neck. It was a lousy name. But everything else started to work fairly easily, fairly early on.
Excellent. And so when you say membership, you were talking about membership of what was then a committee, a national committee, right?
That's right. That's
So what we came to refer to in the future years as NCC's board.
right, right. But it was a committee to develop programs and figure out the best way to use the resources that were gradually decreasing to us.
Right.
You know, I'm trying to remember who was at the meeting. Was at Columbia? I
Yes,
remember right. Yeah. I'm trying to remember who was included on that first board. I believe Tom Reimer was.
yes, and Sharon Minicello and
Minicello and
as
Lynn Kutsukake,
faculty. Hmm?
Lynn Kutsukake from Toronto.
I don't think so.
No, she was never on.
It's we have that on the NCC website somewhere, the complete list of who the members were.
We also had a Japanese representative
Yes,
to
always a Japanese
facilitate
representative. Yes.
communication with Japan, and that was Togasaki Tamio, who
Yes, yes,
right, right.
who
the
had worked at
House of
Columbia
Japan
for some
Library.
years, so was familiar with American libraries, and
Right.
of course was familiar with Japanese libraries.
That's
So there were those faculty, and then it was mostly librarians.
right.
But then you had this big meeting, and all of a sudden you had an agenda of things that needed to be accomplished. And there you, Amy, sat in your office by yourself. Everybody else flew home. So how did you manage to get things off the ground after that?
Well, the only phrase I can think of is rather vulgar, but I worked my fingers to the bone. Eric and Tsujimoto-san provided advice and good counsel. Eric used to always sit next to me at the meetings, and when things were going on, he would say, delegate. He would whisper, delegate. Because my instinct was, if there was something to do, I should do it. But I will say I had by then been a librarian for 4.5 years. So I was still learning a great deal about librarianship. And it was a wonderfully interesting learning curve, but add to that dealing with the NCC, it was a very, very difficult period. Fun in its way, but very difficult. The other thing that I did more or less by myself, again with counsel from Eric and Isao Tsujimoto, was getting NGO status for the organization.
501c3, yeah.
Right. So we could raise money.
Yeah.
And that was really much harder than I expected. I worked with this wonderful IRS agent who told me a story from when he was training as an IRS agent, because I had trouble with the language of the instructions. It wasn't what I understood as English. And he said a teacher of his held up the tax laws in a booklet, big fat book, and said to the class, I have read every word of this big fat set of laws. I have understood every word. I've understood sentences. I have no idea what the meaning was. It was very helpful, but we did get that done. But that was a big chore. The other
Absolutely.
big chore was that there was some distress in the Japanese librarian community that I was chosen for a number of reasons, but the distress was real. They thought it was a bad choice. A lot of people thought it was a bad choice. But I will say, everybody eventually came around to participate because that was clearly the direction that our work, our cooperative work was going in.
I have a follow-up question about that. My sense from having read notes from some of the meetings that preceded the founding of NCC is that a number of very vocal faculty members expressed the view that it was key that NCC be an organization that was a hybrid, that was not simply a library organization and not simply a faculty organization.
Exactly.
And so I have always assumed that one of the key reasons, and probably none of us will ever know, but one of the key reasons you were the obvious candidate was because you had your feet in both of those.
I think that that's true. And I think that that was an extremely important part of our planning because, and in fact, SEAL originally was supposed to include faculty.
Really?
In its history, yes. That didn't last very long, and there was resistance to that in the librarian community because they were afraid that they were going to be told how to do their jobs. And in fact, the faculty was very interested in cooperative activity. Not telling
Yeah.
anybody what to do, but in learning and communicating. The
Right.
faculty was fabulous, one after another.
Well, my sense, having worked with NCC for 18 years, is that the faculty were always extremely well engaged. Often there was a long or a significant learning curve for them, particularly when it came to acronyms.
Yes. Well, that was hard for me when I became a librarian too. I had Diane Perushek made me a long list of all the librarian acronyms so I could manage my interview.
Yeah, exactly. Indeed. Well, another thing that I really wanted to get into this conversation, which is a big digression, it seems, at this moment, but in fact, it's not. It kind of comes full circle. And that is, Amy, to go back to your roots in a way and talk about your relationship with Donald Keene and his relationship with libraries and, in fact, NCC.
Yes, I will. In fact, when I decided that after years, about 7 years, 6 or 7 years of teaching as an adjunct, teaching on a year's appointment in the New York City area because we didn't want to move, I realized that if I seriously wanted an academic career, I would have argued at least with my husband about moving. We would have discussed it. And we never did. We just assumed we were staying. And it finally dawned on me a little slowly that I really wasn't interested in being an academic for my career at a time when a library job came up. And I was a little hesitant about it because Donald Keene, who I will explain further, was always totally supportive of me. And he kept telling me that I shouldn't worry. All his generation was going to retire soon and there would be jobs available. So I should be patient. So when I wrote to him that I was accepting a job in the library, I was a little anxious that he would be disappointed in me or he would feel bad about it. And he wrote back immediately, as he usually did in those days, and said, I think I was meant to be a librarian. He himself, I mean, he loved libraries. There was no question about it. And I always knew that he packed up in cartons books that people gave him, writers all over Japan sent him their newly published books. And he'd keep a few, but he sent the rest to the library. And he packed them in cartons and carried them up to the post office and mailed them himself. So but what I didn't know until I became a librarian was that he also gave gifts of money. He was totally supportive of the library, and he was totally supportive of me becoming a librarian. I had met him for the first time before I started graduate school, because I had majored in English, and I had 2 courses in Japanese anything before I applied to graduate school, including 2 years of Japanese language. And I went to meet him, and I asked him about how I should prepare, because I was worried about it. And he asked me what I majored in, and I told him English literature. And he said that he thought that was a very good preparation, because it's much easier to learn how to make critical judgments in your native language. So everything he ever said to me was as encouraging as that.
That's wonderful.
You know,
And you and Donald did a wonderful tie-on that NCC hosted at the Toshokan Sogo 10 in 2011, or I think 13 maybe, I'm not sure. Anyway, the connection between Donald and you and his sense of libraries was so wonderful to listen to. And NCC was very happy to give him a Lifetime Achievement Award at that time. Probably the least important of most of his awards, but nonetheless, it was a wonderful thing for us to be able to do at that time. So what I wanted to ask a little bit more about the early years, of course, I believe that the creation of the multi-volume set project was one of the important aspects of why the NCC was deemed to be needed. And Amy, do you want to talk about how that got off the ground? I remember from reading materials, you and Yuki Shimatsu were very central to getting that first established.
Well, the idea was that we all wanted some things that we couldn't afford to have, and that we all had different reasons for the things that we wanted. And if we could figure out a way to make the most of what funds were available to us to buy some of these expensive sets, and it turned out we were not only talking about books, but other formats. I think we got some microfilms, although that sounds very old-fashioned now. But the idea was that people could apply for them and show that their library was the best place for that particular set because of other things in their library, because of faculty and graduate student interests. And it would be competitive to that extent, but each library, while it had a chance to get some of the materials it wanted, had to have a particular reason for those materials, which had never been true with the money that we had gotten from the commission or the foundation. So that was the thinking behind it, and it was extremely popular. We got very good applications, and we got a lot of materials. And they had to be available through ILL.
so
no matter where they were. What?
Let me say one thing. You remind me of something. The idea of the shared collection was, I think, what saved funding for actual library development, for collection support from the commission. The commission at that point, when they held the meeting in 1991 and gave some funds, small, very small funds, to support the NCC, at that point, the commission was willing to just say, we've had it with libraries, we're walking away. But several things happened, I think. For one thing, I can't remember if Carol Gluck was on the commission at that point or not. She was a vociferous supporter of library collection development. And I know when she came on, she had a lot to do with setting up professional development plans, such as what brought the executive director of NCC on. We went to other places and did the same. But the idea that you presented to the commission of a sort of a national collection managed, not owned by libraries, that would show purpose for the book, not merely for a national collection, but also on that particular campus. I think your arguments were strong enough to sway a sufficient number of commissioners to support the continued funding of that particular fund, the Shared Collection Development Fund. Otherwise, the commission, I haven't been on the commission since 2011. At this point, I do not know what kind of funding it provides. But at that point, that many years ago, that was one thing that kept the commission in the game of funding actual collection support, as opposed to administrative support for NCC alone.
Yes, and it was a somewhat delicate balance. But the fact is that the applications pretty much recognize that balance between local collections and the national collection.
Right.
So they had to argue for both. And
Yeah.
that was very useful in developing an attitude about a collective responsibility for the nation. What we haven't mentioned yet, and which was happening more and more, is that while more libraries wanted to be included as they were growing bigger and bigger, like Ohio State and UCLA, there were little places that would never have Japanese collections of any value, who we felt also had to be served, which is one of the reasons why we had to insist on interlibrary loan.
Yeah.
Well, going back to that question of small institutions, you were talking about writing the bylaws and so forth. One of the key aspects of NCC, it always seemed to me, was the fact that it is required to have on its board a representation from small institutions and large institutions, and also a good geographical distribution of those.
Yeah, I almost forgot that I wrote the bylaws in talking about what I did, but yes, that was very important.
Right.
Eric, did you just say something?
No, I was just agreeing that it was important for faculty to be on there so that the commission felt that this was not some private, very arcane, esoteric discussion going on among professionals in a cadre, but rather really did reach out across the country. There, at certain points in the commission's history, there was always a swing back and forth between focusing on the few, the very important, the very expensive, versus spreading funds much more broadly to a much broader public. And the bylaws as they were written with the NCC always helped it to remain in the commission's favor, because it did reach small places. And that was a very telling argument for any number of commissioners over the years.
Also, insisting that that faculty be on the committee was very important for a variety of reasons. One, to get their input on library development, but the other for the personal relations that got set up, because it was interesting to see faculty realize how little they knew about libraries.
Yeah.
But they now had a lot of contacts to get questions answered. And the more they worked with librarians, the more questions they had. I remember in one meeting, maybe you remember this too, Eric, Karen Brazell said, she asked a question and everybody said, oh, we talked about that so-and-so. And she said, yes, but you can't hear the answer unless you have the question in your mind. I thought that was just brilliant. And the fact is that when someone like her, who had been on the NCC, had a question in her mind, she knew a lot of people to go to for the answer.
Right.
And that was helpful.
Yeah.
Very helpful. Very helpful. And it's the participation of the smaller institutions in NCC have always been hugely important. I'm thinking of people like Sharon Domeyer, who has always been at a small institution,
Yes.
but has a very high profile and important perspective to bring to
Yes,
discussions.
that's true. And mid-sized libraries who get caught in the squeeze and are neither one nor the other.
Yeah,
That is good.
yeah, no, that is true. So, what more? I think one other thing that we might talk about a little bit, if we have time, is to digress. We've sort of moved time-wise beyond the very beginning, and I think one of the key factors that Eric has raised is the whole tightrope balance that we always had to walk with funders. Amy, you know this well, I know this well, but I remember that when we filled out our Friendship Commission application, we always had a spot on there where we had to refer to our congressional district, and we always made a big pitch about making sure that we stated, for the commissioner's benefit, that NCC served every state in the union and every congressional district. That, of course, brings us to, well, how do we reposition our funding going on into the future? And one of the other major funder for NCC has always been the Japan Foundation, which of course has changed its funding categories and levels of support enormously over time. And it has always been hard, I'm sure Tara faces this too, that we had to go to the commission and say, well, we're not getting as much support from other institutions, and we need to continue to rely on you. And the commission has always been there for us. But as Eric pointed out early on, that is not a guaranteed. Eric, I think this was aimed at you. I mean, we have many times over had to come to you and say, well, we really need your support. It must have been hard over the years to constantly keep funding this little organization that did libraries. And we're very grateful to you for having been there every year for us. I don't know, maybe you have some stories or anything you want to say about the early days in that regard?
Well, I'm trying to remember when it was first proposed that the commission include funding for a professional staff.
I think it was 1994 or 5.
Yeah, it would have been about then, I agree. At that point, the NCC had a kind of a favorable advantage because it was the experiment the commission carried out to create an entire new funding program called infrastructure building.
Mm-hmm.
This was Carol Gluck's primary objective, to get this thing launched. And it was to try to help organize a field of activity in US-Japan exchange of whatever variety. Was it library activity? Was it exchange in the arts? Was it the city exchange, etc.? All of it was happening across. You remember in the 1980s when Japanese investment first began to pour into the United States, we were inundated by chambers of commerce in Boise, Idaho, and
Right.
PTAs in Texas wanting money to try to educate themselves on who their new neighbors were. They just didn't know. We were inundated, and we couldn't respond to it. We had to find a way to respond to local levels without with the very limited funding that we had. And it was Carol's idea that you create a small, very highly professional staff to create a national organizing or coordinating center, management center for the entire field, that whose responsibility would be to sit and think about what the policy issues were, to think of what kind of proposals they might make to various potential funders to support these policy ideas that they had, and to put them in place and show results. The NCC was the model program, and its success and continued success meant that we also worked in this kind of development in the arts, in sister city relationship, a variety of fields of activity across the field of US-Japan exchange. And for that reason, NCC did have a kind of a step up in seeking funding from the commission, but it had to show that it reached deeply into the US. It was not merely focused on the top 10 or top 15 universities, but had
Right.
impact nationally. Because there were commissioners who felt very strongly that commission funds needed to be shared with a very broad spectrum of the American public and not just a few select institutions, elite schools.
Another part of that development, and a place where I don't think we were as successful as I hoped we would be, is that we hoped we would raise funds from other places in the beginning. That's one of the reasons it was important to establish ourselves as a legal entity, was so that we could raise money, and it didn't happen. And
Well, there's a good reason why it didn't happen, because the Japanese economy imploded
there
at
wasn't
just about
money
the same
around.
time
Yeah.
NCC was founded.
Yeah.
Well, thinking about that, one of the major hopes I think we had was that the Japanese publishing industry would take an interest. After all, we were buying their books. So it would make a lot of sense to have an interested party out there directing the buying of those books and keeping funding coming over.
Yeah.
And we hoped that they would be in some way interested in helping support the organization. But as you said, it was a time when the Japanese economy, just as it was getting off the ground, really did collapse into recession. Yeah.
Well, is there any closing comments you want to make, Eric?
Well, all I can say is that the NCC had always been one of my favorite organizations. I enjoyed it very much. I was trained in literature. I also had a great love of libraries. I did get a chance to teach for some years before I took the federal position. But the NCC was my way of keeping current as best I could with what was happening with Japanese studies across the US. It was wonderful.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Amy, you got any parting shots for us?
Well, actually, I was very proud of the work I did on the NCC, and I still am, because it has developed and grown into a really impressive organization. So it was extremely difficult, but it was
worth it.
Likewise, extremely satisfying.
Indeed. Well, thank you both. This has been a wonderful conversation.
And it's a great pleasure to see you all.
Yeah.
It is a pleasure, and it's wonderful to think back on the old days. I love it.
It is, indeed. We should do this more often.
We should.
Yes.